Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I am psychedelic, your host. Gonna have some difficulty doing the show because there's a baby in the studio. It's always hard to concentrate when there's a baby in the studio. Thomas the TikTok engine, baby here. But it's open. No, it's not. It's Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Akin's our guest both hours. You're welcome to call 888-318-7884, 888-31-TRUTH. Usually the lines fill up quite quickly when Jimmy is here, so now would be a good time to dial. If you'd like to get on, you can ask anything you like. Certainly anything about the Catholic faith, but when Jimmy's here, anything means anything. Jimmy's happy to talk to you. 888-318-7884. Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, author of A Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist, and many other things, and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy. I like your hat.
Thank you. I like your not hat. How you doing, psychedelic?
I'm good. You know, I'm only saying I like your hat because I can't actually see you right now. I'm just guessing that you're wearing a hat.
Oh,
I
am, yes. Yeah, I can see you, but you can't see me due to either my powers of invisibility or some kind of glitch in the video system we're using. Yeah. But as long as we got audio, that makes it possible for the folks at home to listen to us.
If you have developed the power of invisibility, that's just unfair. That is too many powers. You have accumulated too many powers, and we're going to have a meeting of the Watchers, the Guardian Council, who's ever in charge of the powers, and discuss the unfairness of all that.
Okay, well, I'm up for discussion on just about anything.
888-318-7884. Like we said, when Jimmy says anything, he means anything. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask, you are welcome to dial that phone and get in the queue. 888-318-7884. I am going to go right...
Actually, before we go to the phones, I've got a piece of podcasting news. Now, normally you ask me on Fridays what's dropped on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, and the answer to that is part 2 of our look at the Zodiac Killer, where we look in particular at his literary career, writing letters to newspapers and stuff, taunting the media after he committed the bulk of his crimes. So that's what's on Mysterious World this week. But there's a whole new podcast featuring Jimmy Akin that is now out. And it's called the Jimmy Akin Podcast, and it's available on YouTube. It's also either available or going to be available on all the standard podcast platforms, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, all those things. And it's also at Catholic.com. So if you're interested in checking out the Jimmy Akin Podcast, this is going to be a podcast where I do a minimum of 1 episode a week, sometimes more than that. The very first episode is about what God really wants most from us. And so if you're interested in checking that out, you can just do an internet search for Jimmy Akin Podcast. Also, the video version is hosted at my YouTube channel, which is the same place Mysterious World's hosted. So to get to both of the podcasts, you can just go to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. And unlike Mysterious World, the new podcast is going to focus on the mysteries of the faith. So it's an apologetics, catechesis, theology-based show.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations to the people of the earth. You asked, and you're getting it. The Jimmy Akin Podcast. I saw that. I got the email on it today, Jimmy. Nice graphic, too, with that. You look great.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very cool. I think that's just wonderful, Jimmy. And I imagine this will immediately become either our most or one of our most popular podcasts. I think people really have been wanting more from you. I don't think they'd probably work you to death if they could. So congratulations on that, Jimmy.
Thanks.
Check it out. Now I'll have to. There'll be multiple questions on Fridays. What dropped on this? What dropped on that? And we'll have more opportunities to talk about new material coming out from Jimmy Akin. All right, now I'm going to go to Michael in Columbia, South Carolina, watching on YouTube. Glad you're here, Michael. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. Question. So I have been regularly attending Sacrament of Reconciliation. And I noticed at the scheduled times that my church has the sacrament that it is really packed. It goes the full hour, so it's great. But this last time I was there, I was the last person to receive individual confession, and then the priest had to push like 20 people into the room to get group confession. And so I'm wondering, like, with the church so large, is the way the sacrament is administered, is it really conducive to ensuring salvation for everyone?
Well, so it sounds like let me talk about the practice you encountered. Now, there is such a thing as group absolution, where in extreme circumstances, like let's say a plane is crashing, or it's a group of soldiers about to get off a troop transport and go into battle, or something like that, where a priest can absolve multiple people at once without their making individual confessions. And it sounds like that's what happened here, because if they all made individual confessions, even if they had 20 of them in the room, that wouldn't have shortened the time. So since he did this as a time shortening measure, it sounds like a group absolution rather than a group confession. Now, there are a few things to know about group absolutions. One of them is they are to only be used in extreme circumstances. And being unable to receive communion at Mass because you haven't been to confession is not one of those. If what the priest should do, and in fact, the Vatican has commented on this and said priests are not to do what it sounds like you encountered, but So it sounds like he was deviating from the rules, because the Vatican has said don't do that. If people have to just wait to go to confession and then receive communion at another Mass, they can do that. And they can still fulfill their Sunday obligation, if it is on a Sunday, by going to this Mass. You don't have to receive communion to fulfill your Sunday obligation. So really the only thing hanging on this is, will you be able to receive communion? And under most circumstances, just having a bunch of people who you don't have time to hear all their confessions is not a sufficient reason to do a group absolution. It really needs to be something extraordinary, like there's life-threatening emergencies that are happening, or the priest is only going to be here for a few minutes and not for another month. This can happen in mission territories and such. The other thing is, even if you do go to a group absolution and receive absolution, you are forgiven, but you still need to go to confession when you have the ability. So it doesn't get you out of the obligation to confess. You still need to confess those sins, even though they've already been absolved. Now, to get to your question about how is this relating to people's salvation? Well, given that your priest or the priest in question didn't deny anybody absolution, well, they're all going to be in a state of grace in terms of what should happen in a parish where stuff like this happens, especially on a regular basis. Priests can't predict one-off events where an abnormally large number of people show up for confession. But if this is happening regularly, what they should do is expand the amount of times that they have confession offered. So they should offer it for longer or more times a week or things like that. And that's the proper way to deal with it. Also, frankly, the priests need to examine their own behavior in confession, because one of the things that I've encountered in confession is a lot of priests just seem to feel they need to give you a whole bunch of advice. And that's not at all the case. They don't need to give you any advice for this sacrament. Advice is not one of the core elements of the sacrament. And frankly, a lot of priests are wasting time, their own time and the time of the penitent and the time of all the other penitents who are in line, by giving a bunch of unneeded advice. This is especially the case when the person comes in and says something like, my last confession was 2 weeks ago, or something like that, because in that case, it's obvious that the person is a regular confession goer and they're taking their spiritual life seriously, and they're probably confessing. This is even on the assumption they don't recognize you if you're not doing this face to face. But even if you're behind a screen and you indicate it's only been a short time since your last confession, the priest can presume that you are a regular penitent, that you are probably confessing recurrent sins here that you're struggling with. You've already thought about them a lot, and you've probably heard all the advice he's going to give you. So they can, I think, frankly, skip a lot of the advice that they give folks. But that's another thing that slows down confession. And if it's causing situations like this to happen regularly, where they just run out of time, they need to think about, do I really need to give all this advice, or is that just wasting people's time?
Michael, thank you for the call. I hope the answer was helpful to you. It brings us right to the break. So we'll take our break and be right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Catch Catholic Answers Live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonk.com. That's Mystic.
EWTN. Communicating the faith.
EWTN is the only radio station I play when I'm in my car. I try to listen to your show as much as I can. I listen at work.
I was riding around yesterday crying. I didn't know about your show, and I turned on EW Blood God Inspired.
My mom, she was the one that got me into EWTN 24/7.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything both hours today, and you're welcome to get in the queue as lines open up, 888-318-7884. Jimmy was just announcing in the last segment the new Jimmy Akin podcast. He will continue to do Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, and what dropped today is part 2 of the... now I forgot the Zodiac Killer. So check that out at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, mysterious.fm, or on Jimmy's Yahoo channel, which will also include the new podcast. The first episode is available now. Off we go now to Dante in Saskatchewan, Canada, listening on the Catholic Answers app. Dante, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello, Jimmy. So my question is, I've been listening to some podcasts, and they seem to believe that the early Eucharist, I think particularly the wine, was psychedelic, and I'm wondering if there's any validity to that.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what podcast you've been listening to, but I know there's been some discussion of this, like on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I haven't, I'd have to hear the details of the claim they're making, but it sounds like it's derived from a book that came out a number of years ago called, 1970, called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. It was by an author named John Allegro, and he argued that psychedelic mushrooms, that Christianity basically started as a psychedelic mushroom cult. And so the early Christians were getting high on sacred mushrooms, and they would write about this in terms of the Eucharist. And eventually Christianity got away from this. But, I suppose you could argue that the wine they were drinking in communion was laced with magic mushrooms or something like that. Wine itself is not hallucinatory. It is psychoactive. It will have an effect on your mind if you drink enough of it. But we have evidence from the New Testament itself that that is not supposed to be the way that you do communion. In 1 Corinthians, St. Paul is chastising the Corinthian community for a variety of Eucharistic abuses, and one of them is, he says, some people at your services are getting drunk, and they shouldn't do that. Now, it's not technically clear because they often celebrated a meal in conjunction with the Eucharist. These meals were called agapes. Agape is one of the Greek words for love. And so they would have a meal, a communal meal, celebrating the love of the Christian community, an agape, and they would also do communion in the context of that meal. So he may not be thinking of getting drunk on consecrated wine, but on regular wine that people were drinking as part of the meal. In any event, he indicates you're not supposed to be getting drunk at this event. So even though wine is psychoactive, if you drink enough of it, you're not supposed to be drinking that much of it. And this is first century, Christian literature indicating you're not supposed to do it that way. Well, if you're not going to be getting drunk, you're scarcely going to be getting high. So, if the whole point of communion was to get high on mushrooms or anything else, you wouldn't have this prohibition on getting drunk right there in 1 Corinthians, which was written about AD 53. So this is extremely early. This is just 20 years after the crucifixion, and it's already clear you're not supposed to be taking communion in a way that's going to be psychoactive and much less psychedelic. And so the vast majority of biblical scholars have concluded that John Allegro's book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, is just nuts, that it was a spectacular intellectual flameout where he just twisted evidence in all kinds of ways that do not correspond to reality.
Dante, that makes sense to you?
That seems to make sense to me. Jimmy?
All right, well, thank you for the call. Nice to talk with you up there in Canada. On we go. We're going to Levi now in Virginia, listening on Catholic.com. Levi, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hi. I guess the term is Pax Christi to both of you, to you, Cy, and to you, Jimmy.
Well, to you as
Et
well.
cum
Thank you.
spiritu tuo.
Okay. This is a little nervous. Before I start, I just want to say, Jimmy, I remember, I love your stuff. I remember listening to both of your debates with both of your recent debates with James White, and I just remember I was floored by both of them, especially the one on justification. But that's not the question I have today.
But it's very kind of you to share it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And you too, Cy. You're doing well.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'm feeling well. All right. Now go ahead with your question.
All right. I guess it should be explained fairly simply. The big question I have is just about the papacy, and really how can we arrive to the modern idea of the papacy. So the question I have kind of stems from an argument I heard, which basically I've summarized in my own way, which is how can we weigh the idea of the modern papacy with its charisms of primacy and supremacy, infallibility, all that, to where it's something that can be falsifiable, and it's not just we're believing a dogmatic assertion, like the church says so kind of thing. We have writings from the fathers, such as, the Epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, Ignatius of Antioch's Epistle to the Romans, Irenaeus, and more explicit stuff such as from Jerome and Augustine, talking about the primacy of the Pope, his connection to Peter, the importance of the Bishop of Rome. But how can we get the modern idea of the papacy, such as we get from, say, Vatican I, from such claims without having to kind of go around in circles?
All right.
Okay, well, one of the things that I would point out whenever someone asks a question like this is just as a helpful exercise in epistemology or theory of knowledge is to say, is to look for parallel cases that are not in dispute. Like you could say, well, how can we know that Jesus is exactly, a fully human and fully divine person without admixture and commingling, and he's got a complete divine nature and a complete human nature, including two complete wills, a divine will and a human will? Well, okay, you would want to say, how do we know that, which is a fairly precise claim that goes beyond the language that's used in Scripture. And it actually took the church several centuries to formulate the doctrine of Christ that precisely. So what we don't want to do is pick on one doctrine, like, Catholic teaching on the papacy, and apply a different set of standards to it than we use in general. So I think it's helpful to look at parallel cases like the divinity of Christ, the precise nature of the person of Christ, and figure out what standards we think are reasonable for that, and then apply the same standards to the question of the papacy. So in the case of the divinity of Christ, well, one of the concepts you mentioned is falsifiability. Now, falsifiability is a big thing in modern science. In fact, based on the work of Karl Popper, some people would say a proposition is not scientific unless it can be falsified using empirical evidence. That doesn't mean it's false. If you can't falsify it, it could well be true. But at least in order to regard something as science, many people would say it needs to be experimentally falsifiable. That's generally not the case in religion, though. If you talk to people of any religious persuasion, we're doing theology, not science. And so if you talk to a Protestant, they're generally not thinking in terms of falsifiability. And if you talk to an Orthodox or a Catholic, they're generally not thinking in terms of falsifiability. They're thinking in terms of verifiability. Do we have positive evidence in the sources that support a particular theological proposition? And having a falsifiable test is generally not applied in theology because that's a different domain of knowledge. That's science rather than theology. So however, if you want to phrase things in terms of falsifiability, you could say, okay, is there an absence of evidence in the sources that supports a particular theological proposition? So in the case of the divinity of Christ, you could say, well, if there's an absence of material in our sources, whatever you take that to be, whether it's Scripture alone or Scripture in the early church fathers, if there's just nothing in there supporting the idea that Jesus is God and that Jesus is man, then you could say that falsifies it. It really doesn't, but at least it doesn't verify it. However, there is loads of material in both the New Testament and in the early church fathers supporting the idea that Jesus is both God and man. It's then a question of working out what are the precise implications of that. And frankly, this is a place where we have to trust the Holy Spirit in his guidance of the church. Over the course of several centuries, through theological reflection, the Holy Spirit led the church to recognize Jesus has a full human nature and a full divine nature, including even a divine will and a human will. Well, okay, we can then take those principles and apply them to the question of the papacy. Is there information in our sources, whether the New Testament or the early church fathers, supporting the idea that Peter and his successors, the bishops of Rome, have a special authority in the church? And yes, there is. Well, just like we allowed the Holy Spirit to guide the church in developing the understanding of the person of Christ, we can allow the Holy Spirit to guide the church in understanding the precise details of how the papacy works. And some of that doctrinal development occurred early on. Other particular questions, like is he infallible and how exactly does his jurisdiction work, that took longer to sort out. But in principle, if we acknowledge the Holy Spirit is guiding the church over the course of its history, then we can trust the Holy Spirit to guide the church correctly as it works out the fine details of the material that is undeniably there in our fundamental sources, the New Testament and the early church fathers.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I can come back to you, but we only have a few seconds before the break. But does that make sense to you?
Yeah, seems to. Yeah.
I thought so as well.
I feel like I'm sorry. I'm stuttering.
No, that's right.
Okay.
It's a lot to process. But I just wanted to make sure that we had gotten to what you wanted to get to, and it sounds like we did get to what you wanted to get to. And thank you very much for the call and for the question, and also for the very many kind words. We have to take a quick break. It's Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin this hour and next. You are welcome to call with your questions, whatever they are. 888-318-7884. We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
Deepen your connection to the Church's holy days and seasons while you draw on the wisdom of the Church Fathers. Feasts of Our Fathers, the new book from Mike Aquilina and Adam Lucas, is a treasury of history, prayers, insights, and lessons that will bring you closer to the earliest of Catholic traditions. Take your prayer life and your solidarity with the Church, past and present, to a new level. Order your copy of Feasts of Our Fathers today at shop.catholic.com.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore. Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. The number is 888-318-7884. I'm going to probably keep mentioning it because it's exciting news. Jimmy's got a new podcast, the Jimmy Akin Podcast. Check it out. You can get it on YouTube. That's probably a great place to get it because it'll also be there with Jimmy's his Mysterious World podcast. So, but do search for it, Jimmy Akin. And the first episode is out. It's not like we're announcing this as a future thing. It is out now, so you can check out Jimmy Akin's new podcast. One of the things we do around here is we take questions for TikTok from Thomas, the TikTok engine. You have another question from TikTok, Thomas?
I do indeed, Si. I have one to bring to Jimmy and have him answer, and then give it right back to the good people of TikTok who follow us.
Oh, all right. Onward we go. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Jimmy, this person commented under a recent video we posted about when you talked about the Catholic Church chaining up Bibles and why they did that. This person said they, and I believe he means the Catholic Church, killed William Tyndale for translating the Bible into English because they didn't want anyone to have it.
Yeah, well, that's simply false. In the first place, William Tyndale was he was a problematic individual who got in trouble in England, and then he fled to the continent, and he was arrested and imprisoned near Brussels. And the charges against him were not translating the Bible. The charges against him were heresy. And while he was imprisoned, he and the folks who were going to be judging his case conducted an extensive dialogue in which they allowed him to write a book articulating his views, and then they wrote actually more than one book responding to his views. And if you look at those books, there's nothing about Bible translation in them. The charges against him were heresy. Also, while he was in prison, they let him continue working on his translations from Hebrew. So they didn't have a problem with him doing Bible translations. Furthermore, if the goal had been to prevent people from reading the Bible in English, well, that horse was already out of the barn, because there had been bunches of English translations of either parts or wholes of the Bible for centuries, such as the Aldhelm Psalms and the Lindisfarne Gospels and bunches of other translations that dated to centuries and centuries before William Tyndale's time, and they were in English. And so the church just didn't have a problem with that. The charges against him were heresy, not Bible translation.
All right. Thank you very much, Jimmy. That will lay the matter of Tyndale to rest once and for all.
I wonder, will it?
I know.
Are matters ever laid to rest once and for all, Thomas?
Not on TikTok. You got to keep that content cranking.
Yep.
You know?
Well, we'll keep it cranking. We're
right.
always happy when you visit.
Will
Thanks.
do. Thanks for helping me out.
All right, let's go to Newport Beach. Luke is in Newport Beach, California, watching on YouTube. Luke, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, thanks. Just wondering, what are the basics of social Trinitarianism and its main differences from the classical view of the Trinity?
Okay, so social Trinitarianism is a theological concept that stresses the concept of the Trinity as a society of persons. And so, classical Trinitarianism acknowledges that God is one being who is three persons. And social Trinitarianism focuses on God as a community or society of persons. It is sometimes accused of violating classical Trinitarianism and disagreeing with the Nicene Creed by not paying enough attention to the oneness of God. And it depending on the version of social Trinitarianism that one is endorsing, I think that can be a fair charge. If you just said, well, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are each a God, and they're in a society together, then you'd have three gods, and that wouldn't be monotheism. And, for example, Mormons have a view like that. They'll define the Trinity as the society of these three independent beings, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But they're not one God in the sense that traditional Christians believe in one God. On the other hand, I can see other versions of social Trinitarianism that are not unorthodox, where they're simply emphasizing the nature of God as a society of persons without denying that there is underneath that society fundamentally one being that's divine. And so I think, at least to my mind, social Trinitarianism can be either orthodox or unorthodox, depending on how it's articulated by an individual theologian.
Okay, Luke?
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the call. On we go. Rick is in Channelview, Texas, also watching on YouTube. Rick, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Thank you for having me. My question consisted more of the spiritual realm. I was interested in knowing, once you become sentient of the spiritual realm, purgatory. I recently became aware of the fact that wayward souls can get attached to a person. And what exactly can we do as Christians to help these souls? Because I do understand that they can impact you on a daily. And I just want to know, what can we do? I understand there's prayer, but can we command them to go to the feet of Jesus? And, what exactly, where is our strength in this spiritual battle when it comes to afflictions of this manner?
Okay, well, first of all, I think we should talk about the idea of spirit attachment. What leads you to believe that this happens? That a spirit can become attached to a person? So recently I was a family member of mine. We went to, I wouldn't call it an exorcism, but it was more like a prayer. And Deliverance
the priest
prayer,
that was
okay.
performing the prayer, there was people that were interceding. And one of the souls that was detached from this person that I was near was a person that was a mutual friend between me and this person that was getting prayed for. And there was the people that were interceding. One of the ladies fell and started speaking with his voice and speaking in the manner of him. I recognized who was speaking, but it wasn't the woman that was speaking. And the priest, obviously, when this happened, he commanded the soul to go to the feet of Jesus, right? But us as lay people, what can we do? Because I know the priest has the power, right? He's part of the apostolic succession. But us as lay people, do we just have to depend on a priest, or where exactly? I understand, we can utilize the sacraments, but how can we pray for these wayward souls that can possibly get attached to us?
Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk a little bit more about spirit attachment. Now, I'm not saying it never happens. I think it is possible for a spirit to have a human spirit to take a special interest in a person and perhaps even have an effect on the person where they start speaking with their voice or stuff like that. I believe that's possible. Having said that, we need to be somewhat cautious in this matter, because it's easy to let our imagination run away with us. Before concluding that a human spirit is definitely attached to somebody in some way, we need to consider the evidence for that. Now, in your case, you say that the person started speaking in a recognizable manner, like the departed friend that you knew or acquaintance that you knew, and that would be evidence that it could be that person's spirit. On the other hand, if the person who was speaking this way had also known the deceased person, it could just be their imagination, or there could be mental illness involved, or there could be a number of things involved. So I don't think we should too quickly conclude that this is happening. And if someone proposes spirit attachment without significant evidence that a spirit actually is involved, we can get into a fearful, superstitious situation where we're afraid that we're being the victim of spirits or being influenced by spirits, when in fact we're not. And so I think we need to have a healthy critical sense in looking at claims of this nature, because if you just assume they're all true, you can get yourself into a really fearful state totally unnecessarily. Having said that, what are our options if such a situation does occur? Well, we can pray for the spirit in question. In fact, that's a traditional Catholic approach. Whenever a spirit of a departed person who's not in heaven, it's not one of the saints, is manifested, we pray for that person. We can have mass said for that person. We can perform devotions for that person. We could obtain indulgences for that person. All these things to help them out. Can we then tell them to go to the feet of Jesus or something like that? Well, sure. You can tell a spirit anything you want to. This is not an exorcism, and it's not reserved to priests. So you could say, you're bugging me, get out of here, or you're bugging me, go to the feet of Jesus, or something like that. Now, that doesn't mean we're divinely empowered that it's certainly going to obey us, but you can certainly tell it that. And if that helps you out, then that's fine. You can also pray to God about the situation. You can pray the St. Michael prayer. You can pray bunches of things. So there are a lot of options here. The only one that's excluded for lay people is you can't perform a full-blown major exorcism. That you got to be a specially appointed priest for.
Rick, that brings us to the break. Thank you. I hope that was helpful to you. We're going to take that break and be right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley, the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul? And that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Another great podcast on EWTN Podcast Central is The Catholic Conversation. Steve and Becky Green help Catholics faithfully live their vocation by navigating moral challenges and exploring current issues facing the faith in our culture. You can hear The Catholic Conversation and other faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world, all in one place, all free at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click on Podcast Central today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. We're having fun. Jimmy Akin's here with 2 hours today, and so we get 2 hours of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin, where you are welcome to call. I do not think I have said it, but you don't have to be Catholic. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to call. Anyone is welcome. You're welcome to ask your question. 888-318-7884, the number. I just keep going straight back to the phones because they just keep staying full. So off we go now to Mark in Fort Collins, Colorado, listening on EWTN Radio. Glad to have you, Mark. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, Jimmy. Hi, Cy. Really appreciate your show. I've been looking forward to today because I have a question. I'm taking a catechism class. I got a homework assignment. We're studying the section from 1730 to 1760. I think I understand the material. there's a suggested
1730 in the Catechism?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Paragraph 1730 to 1760, that whole section. There's an answer to one of the homework questions, a suggested answer that I'm having some disagreement with. So I figured out what the real question is in my mind. And every word here really matters. Does man have a right to choose evil? I'm not asking whether or not it's appropriate or moral or justified to choose evil. I'm asking if we have a right to choose evil.
Okay.
The way that
Go ahead.
The way that theologians would classically answer this is by saying no, because a right is something that in theology is understood as something you are entitled to do, as opposed to having the ability to do. And so we and there's a famous saying in the history of theology: error has no rights. So nobody has a right, for example, let's take murder as an example. That's an evil act. Nobody has a right to murder. People have the ability to murder, but nobody has the right to murder. And so so that's how theologians would traditionally answer that question. They would say, no, we have the ability to do evil, but that's not the same thing as saying we have the right to do evil.
Yeah, I understand every word you said, and I get it. One of the answers off of Catholic Answers says, yes, man has a right to choose, but this choice must align with God's will. So it's interesting to me to qualify the right with the restriction that it has to be moral.
In accordance with God's will. Yeah.
Yes, very good. Okay. I'm going to go with what you said as the right answer. And by the way, that agrees with the suggested answer in the homework. So I'm delighted. Do I have time to ask another question?
Real quick.
Yep.
Very quickly. If two people have well-formed consciences, both of them are well-formed, in the same situation, would we expect them both to make the same choice?
Ordinarily, yes. Assuming the situation is the same. If the situations are different in some relevant respect, then they might, with a well-formed conscience, arrive at different conclusions. We're also assuming that in addition to having the well-formed conscience, that they have comparable levels of discernment in applying that well-formed conscience. But ordinarily, if the circumstances are the same, the formation of the conscience is good, and their reasoning abilities are the same, you would expect the same outcome. That doesn't guarantee the same outcome, but you would expect it.
Mark, thanks very much. Anybody needing help with homework, give a call, 888-318-7884.
Actually, no. I'm making an exception. When people email me, it's like, can you do my homework for me? I'm sorry, I have to draw the line somewhere.
Thanks, Mark. Well, yeah, I got time. Denise is in Lincoln, Nebraska. Welcome, Denise. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I'm coming back after many years to the Catholic Church, so I'm listening to EWTN. Thank you. And so my daughter is already Catholic and goes to church, and so when I visit her, I went to her church, and her daughter was being a server along with her son, and I said, well, what's with that? And she says, well, they allow it, and I said, okay. And so then I was just talking to her now, and she says that now all the servers are girls. And I told her that I listened to an apologist on EWTN who was a priest about this question. He was answering for someone else. And he said, well, actually, they did allow that for a while, but they pulled back on it after thinking about it because they think that having girls as servers encourages them to think that they could become priests, which I understand is some of the reason behind having boy servers, so that they can get a glance at what the priestly life is like and maybe encourage vocation. So what is the real answer on that?
Well, as far as I'm aware, Altar servers are permitted to be male or female, and there hadn't been any guidance coming out of the Vatican that I'm aware of that would suggest a change in that. Now, individual bishops and pastors can make decisions for their own diocese and their own parishes, and maybe individuals are rethinking that and changing policies and pulling back. But in general, the way the law is written and interpreted by the Vatican, altar servers can be either male or female, and I am unaware of any guidance coming from the Vatican or the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops that would point in a different direction or establish a different preference to allow in both equally. And I would be quite surprised to be unaware of that, because I subscribe to the Bishops' Committee on Liturgy newsletter, and so I'm in touch with all the guidance coming out of Rome and the National Conference regarding this. And so I would be very surprised if I was unaware of something official that had come down on this that would suggest a change in practice. So I'm unable to explain where the priest you heard got this. It may be something anecdotal that he was thinking about. It could be something that, but or something unofficial that some people are doing in some places, but that's not what the law says and not the guidance that I'm aware of.
Okay, Denise?
Well, as you were speaking and explaining that, he did mention something about different dioceses could do different things. So maybe that's true in that case.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You know what I mean? You said something about bishops. Okay, well, that answers that. That makes me feel better.
Denise, tell you what, I'd like to share with you a little book that Jimmy wrote called The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness, and Where to Find It. It's wonderful news that you're coming back to the Catholic faith, and I'd love you to have that book. If you want it, just hang on, and we'll get an address from you and send it off. Off we go to Richmond, Texas, where Scott is listening on the Catholic Answers app. Scott, thanks for downloading the app onto your phone. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, good evening, Cy and Jimmy. Quick question. When Saul is pursuing David in the Old Testament, can we see that as a prefiguring of Saul, who would later become Paul, in the New Testament persecuting the church?
Well, so you've got two guys named Saul, and they both persecute somebody connected with David. The first Saul persecutes the original David, and the second Paul persecutes the followers of the son of David. So there are some connections there, and anytime there are connections there, you can propose that that this is a prefigurement. So yeah, you can propose that. I wouldn't make a lot out of it, because there are also notable differences here. For example, the second Saul ends up becoming a follower of Jesus, and the first Saul did not end up becoming a follower of David. So, but anytime there are parallels, you can say, yeah, there are parallels here. I just wouldn't attribute a super high level of significance to that. But yeah, there are parallels, and you can say, okay, to the extent those parallels hold, this prefigures that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Jimmy and Cy.
Thank you, Scott. Nice talking with you. I'm just going quick because I'm trying to get as many on as I can before the top of the hour comes. We'll do another hour, so don't worry if you're on the line. But let's go to Andrew in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, watching on YouTube. Welcome, Andrew. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello, Jimmy. So I'll get right to it. Basically, do you think that Funko Pops and action figures and anime figures can be considered modern-day idols? And I ask this in the context of Revelation 9:20, which is basically John's vision into the future, and he sees that in the future people still worship made idols. And also, whereas back in the day they would shape material into the images of Moloch or the false gods, nowadays it's like we shape plastic into the images of the quote-unquote new gods like Darth Vader, Marvel Thor.
Oh, all right. I think I'm not sure we lost you right there at the end, but I think we certainly have enough for Jimmy to give you an answer.
Okay, so first thing is the book of Revelation in chapter 9 is actually, by my reading, not talking about our future. It's talking about the Greco-Roman world in St. John's day, and that persists until you get up to chapter 20, where we read about this long period of time called the millennium, which is, it's a symbol of 1,000 years, but that's just a symbol of a really long period of time. And that's actually when we are right now. Christ is reigning in heaven and through his church on earth, and the devil is bound in such a way that he can't stop the proclamation of the gospel and deceive the nations. And this is the ordinary reading we'd expect of the book of Revelation, given that at the beginning and the end, it says Revelation is describing what's going to happen soon. And so that would lead us to conclude on an ordinary reading that the bulk of the book is going to be happening soon from the perspective of John's audience. And so actually it looks like chapter 9 is applying to the first century. Chapter 9, verse 20 does refer to how the rest of mankind who were not followers of the Lamb didn't repent of the work of their hands and give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and things like that. Now, that refers to idols, but it doesn't tell us anything about Funko Pops or action figures. We need to think about what an idol is. An idol is not just a statue. An idol is something that you literally believe is a deity. In fact, they had a rite in various ancient locations where after they made the statue of the god, they would then consecrate it so that the deity would take up residence in the statue. And until that was done, it's just a statue. It's not an idol. An idol is a statue that you believe really is a god. And so in the literal sense, Funko Pops and action figures are not idols unless you think that they are literally gods. Most fans of Funko Pops and action figures don't think that. So for most of them, they're not actually gods.
Andrew, thanks for the call. There are 2 lines open now, and you're welcome to call if you'd like to get on for the second hour. We'll continue Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin for another hour. If you're on the line, stay on the line. If you haven't called yet, but you'd like to, 888-318-7884. Anybody is welcome. Any question at all, 888-318-7884. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. And all the lines are full right now. I am Cy Kellett, your host. And you know what, Jimmy? I saw there was news, and it's related to something you have talked about on this show, and I don't think anyone else has talked about, is that document that came out, the Vatican document on kind of how to proceed when there are claims of apparitions and supernatural things. And now there's some news based on that from Medjugorje, and I think that's what a lot of people have been waiting for. So can you kind of run us through what that's all about, what was said?
So first of all, for more information, I wrote a piece about this for the National Catholic Register. They asked me to do a piece on it for them, so you can read that for more detail. But basically, what I suspected might happen did happen. After the announcement of the new norms for evaluating reports of private apparitions, they took Cardinal Fernandez was asked if they were going to do Medjugorje, and he said at the time, well, I haven't reviewed that material yet, but we should be able to proceed to a decision now. And even though one of the now 7 categories for classifying reports of an apparition sounded like it was tailor-made for Medjugorje, he kind of went in a different direction. He raised the possibility of giving it what's called a nihil obstat, which means nothing obstructs the faithful from having a devotion to this, but with some clarifications. And that's what they did. So a nihil obstat is now the highest ruling, the most positive ruling that can be given to an apparition without the direct intervention of the Pope. What a nihil obstat does not do is pass any judgment on, is this genuinely supernatural or not? And so the Vatican has not made a ruling on, are the reported apparitions at Medjugorje supernatural. In fact, at the conclusion of the new document on it, they say that 3 times. So they're really wanting to make it clear, we're not saying whether this is supernatural or not. But they say, a lot of the messages associated with it are wholesome and can be used for devotional purposes by the faithful. And there's good spiritual fruit, conversions and reconciliations of marriages and stuff like that connected with Medjugorje. And so the faithful can have a reasonable devotion here. But there are some clarifications they needed to insist on. And so you can read the article or the original document, which is linked in the article, for more information about that. Basically, it leaves us in the same position that we were in before. People who think that Medjugorje is supernatural can continue to think that, but they've been put on notice by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith that not all the messages should just be regarded as this is the will of heaven. They specifically say that some of the messages can be misleading or are misleading, and there are some things in them that you just need to not pay attention to. So if you're going to think it's supernatural, don't be thinking it's just this is what heaven says. On the other hand, they say that if you don't think Medjugorje is supernatural, you're welcome to think that too. But they have ruled that there are genuine spiritual fruits connected with Medjugorje, and so you shouldn't be downplaying those either.
All right. And it does seem like that document that came out earlier is working. It seems like that was kind of like a little bit of Drano in the pipe. Like, let's get some things moving, and it's actually getting some things moving.
Absolutely. Since the new norms came out in mid-May, they have now issued 10 rulings on individual reports of supernatural phenomena. So they really have broken the dam on that, and a lot more water's flowing through. They're really proceeding through these at a good clip.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for going through it, because I know you have been kind of keeping us up to date on that. As a matter of fact, I don't think I would have even known about it if you hadn't brought it up on the show.
Also, I will be doing an episode of Mysterious World on this, but it'll be a few months before it's out.
All righty. All right, on we go to the phones. Thanks, everybody, for waiting. Matthew's in Greenville, South Carolina, listening on Catholic.com. That's our website, Catholic.com. Matthew, go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
All right. First of all, hi, Jimmy. But
howdy.
I've been looking through some of these arguments that people try and make about, like, oh, the Bible really doesn't say anything about consensual loving monogamous gay relationships, or the Bible, you know, it kind of endorses monogamy, it implies it, but it doesn't hardcore condemn polyamory. And looking at these arguments from both sides, I definitely really lean towards the idea that, like, the Bible does condemn homosexuality, it does endorse monogamy. But when I hear the arguments from the other side, I can see how someone could maybe potentially kind of try and reach a conclusion. I think there's a few points, but I don't find it very convincing. But what I'm curious is, like, why did the Bible leave any room for an argument at all? Why is there any wiggle room? Like, why didn't Jesus or Paul just black and white say marriage is between one man and one woman and not men or two women? Like, why didn't it just lay it out in such a way where there just is no wiggle room whatsoever? Like, no one can make a case for otherwise at all. Like, there's just no ambiguity whatsoever.
Well, I would say it. I would say it doesn't leave any wiggle room on this question. The way marriage is presented in the Bible, it's always between a man and a woman for purposes of the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. And it indicates that, like, for example, it doesn't always indicate that it's just one man and one woman. In the Old Testament, they weren't yet at the stage of doctrinal development where they were ready for that. So they had polygamy, which is one man and multiple women. They had that in the Old Testament. But then when Jesus arrives, he makes it clear that God's pattern for marriage is to be found in God's creation of Adam and Eve, which is Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve and Barbara and Sally. So you have monogamy in the case of Adam and Eve, and that's God's plan for marriage in general, according to Jesus. You also have repeated condemnations of homosexual behavior, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, where, for example, in Romans, at the beginning of Romans, Paul talks about how the Greeks, abandoned knowledge of God, and God gave them up to depraved minds so that they left aside the natural use of women. Notice he says natural, and burned for lust with each other, both men burning with lust for other men and women burning with lust for other women. And so this is clearly presented as an unnatural situation that's contrary to God's love. So I think on any fair reading, there just isn't wiggle room on this. Now, you can try to gin up wiggle room by adding qualifiers that, you could always, even if you produced a passage which, condemned homosexual marriage, you could say, oh, but it didn't address what if you dye your hair purple first? Maybe purple dyed hair homosexuals can marry each other. You can always add qualifiers to create a situation that's not directly addressed in the text. But such tactics are dodges. And so if you start adding qualifiers like mutually reciprocal love and stuff, on top of the text, you're playing games. It's real clear the text does reject this. On the other hand, it doesn't address every conceivable situation, and that's because this is not a text of moral theology. The Bible is an organic document that's not written to answer abstract questions in every conceivable variation that one could come up with. It's meant to establish basic principles for the life of God's people, and it's written in a particular time and culture, so it reflects the concerns that were present in that time and culture, not scenarios that are going to arise in other cultures thousands of years later. So it's not, you have to take into account the base culture that wrote these documents and what was of concern to them. It's not meant to be an abstract, timeless text. That's why we also have apostolic tradition in addition to Scripture, and why we have the apostolic magisterium that can respond to changing concerns and questions that come up in later ages. So, if you have a text that was written at a particular period, you can and you come around 2,000 years later, you're going to have concerns and questions that weren't envisioned by the ancient authors, and that's why we need the magisterium to help apply the principles that are in our original sources in an accurate way, guided by the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Matthew. Got to take the first break. Right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
From Rome to your home, EWTN's Vatican Bureau lets you watch all of the important events from Rome, even if you don't have a TV. Using the latest technology, we've made it possible to watch the latest news from the Holy See, all delivered directly to your home. Watch live on EWTN YouTube and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. EWTN is the global Catholic network.
Catholic Answers Live. Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy's got a new podcast. Just search Jimmy Akin Pod. Well, now maybe you should say where people should go for the Jimmy Akin podcast. I don't want to mess it up right from day one, Jimmy.
Well, you can go to jimmyakinpodcast.com, or you can go to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. It's also got a homepage on Catholic.com in the podcast section, but I'd say the simplest way to get there, you can also search for it on podcast apps, because it's going to be on all of them, Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Stitcher and all those things. So it's really up to you and your preferred listening method. But I always encourage folks to go to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin.
Check it out. It's brand new. Just dropped today, right? Is today the first?
No. It was a couple 3 days ago.
Oh, all right.
This is the first time I've been on the show since it dropped. And it's normally going to be coming out every Monday. If we have one episode a week, it'll always be Monday. If we have additional episodes, they'll appear Tuesday through Thursday.
All righty. Let's go to Charleston, South Carolina. Matt is watching on YouTube. Matt, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, y'all. Thanks for taking my call. Mr. Akin, I'm a huge fan of Mysterious Worlds and been heavily referencing Fathers Knows Best recently, so thank you so much for those invaluable resources. They've been absolute blessing for me. Look, I'm kind of in the midst of a little nod to Stephen Ray here, a recrossing of the Tiber moment. I feel pretty spiritually unfulfilled and a little confused. I believe the Lord is kind of calling me back to the Catholic Church where I grew up.
Good.
So my question is a little bit more technical, so hold your britches here. It pertains to Matthew 16:18, but I'm not asking about the usual interpretation of Peter being the rock. I've already crossed Tiber on that. But instead, it's more of the use of the term the church, or ecclesia in Greek and kahal in Aramaic. As you know, ecclesia and kahal primarily denote like a gathering or an assembly of people rather than a hierarchical structure. In the context of an ancient Greek city-state, ecclesia referred to an assembly of citizens for deliberate purposes, which seemed to emphasize communal decision-making rather than a centralized authority. So given this, is there theological or historical basis for understanding that Christ intended a structural ecclesial authority, such as the papacy or episcopal governance, when he used the term ecclesia in this passage specifically?
Okay, so kahal is the Hebrew word that corresponds to ecclesia in Greek. I'd have to check what the Aramaic equivalent of kahal is. I'm sure it's a cognate of kahal, so it's going to sound the same, like maybe kehala or something. But they all three have the same root concept, and that root concept is an assembly. Now they have sub meanings that are based on context. For example, in the Hebrew Bible, kahal is sometimes used for like an assembly for purposes of making war. It's also used more generally for the assembly of the community as a whole. You mentioned a particular use of ecclesia in Greek polises, Greek cities, and I'm not denying that usage. I haven't seen it documented, but it wouldn't surprise me. But what you can't do is go and find one particular usage like deliberative communal decision making without a leader in a Greek city-state, and assume that that's what the author of Matthew, who is a Jew, is thinking when he uses the term. What you can do is look at parallel usages in Hebrew and in later Christian Greek, and there are uniquely religious usages of kahal, and they are not inconsistent with having a leader or leaders in the kahal. That was a standard part of Jewish religious life. You had priests as leaders, you had elders as leaders, you had tribal leaders in Israel. So they had leaders in Israel. It wasn't just, let's all get together and democratically make decisions. That's not how Hebrew society worked. And so we wouldn't expect to read that meaning into the Aramaic that Jesus was using when he taught this. But we don't have to stop at linguistic studies, because we can examine the immediate context. So what happens immediately after Jesus tells Peter, on this rock, meaning you, Peter, I'm going to build my church? Well, that of itself would imply that Peter has a leadership role in this assembly, in this community. But then Jesus goes on to say, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And he says, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. That's a reference to the key that the chief steward of the house of David had. So he's saying, you're going to be the chief steward of my house, the house of the new David. So that explicitly gives him a leadership role. And then he says, whatever you bind on earth is going to be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is going to be loosed in heaven. And the power of binding and loosing, we know from parallels, like in the Jewish historian Josephus, referred to the ability to establish and modify and abrogate laws for the community. So it's a legislative judicial function. And so this is again indicating that Jesus expects his kahal, his ecclesia, to have leaders and laws and judgments and things like that. And it's not simply a democratic, let's get together and debate things and come to a consensus club. We also find other passages in the New Testament that clearly indicate that the Christian church is structured hierarchically. Later, in 2 chapters later in Matthew, where Jesus refers for the second time in the Gospels to his church, he shares the power to bind and loose with the other disciples. He doesn't share the keys, but he does share the power to bind and loose. And if you read, Acts, we've got apostles and we've got evangelists and we've got elders. If you read St. Paul's letters, we have the same offices with the addition of episcopoi, bishops or overseers. And we have instructions in the New Testament to things like, honor those who are, or obey those who are over you in the Lord, implying a hierarchical structure. So it's really clear that Jesus intended his community to be hierarchically structured and have leaders. That's why he appointed the 12 disciples to be the original chief leaders. So I would say we've got abundant evidence for the idea of the church as a hierarchically structured institution.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to keep moving. Lines continue full, and off we go to Hayden, Idaho, where our friend Emma is listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Welcome back, Emma. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Thank you, Cy. Jimmy, I'm hoping you can unpack what the Pope said about after his Asia, tour, that he said all religions lead to God and we all worship the one God.
Yeah, he didn't say that.
Okay, tell me what he said.
Okay, so this was at his stop in Singapore, and, as normal, when the Pope says something, people rip it out of context and blast it all over everywhere without the surrounding context to make it clear. Basically, now the first thing you got to do is frame this in terms of who's talking. And one of the things we know about Pope Francis is he places a high priority on evangelization. The first document that he issued upon becoming Pope was all about evangelization and the need to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with people. And he's regularly hit that theme. When he reorganized the Vatican, he made the congregation, or now dicastery, for evangelization first, above the one for the doctrine of the faith. So evangelization and sharing the gospel of Christ is really important to this Pope. So you got to bear that in mind when you read the text. So what happens when we read the text? Well, we find out that he sets aside, because he mentions it, he set aside the prepared speech he had that he was going to give to these young people and just talk off the cuff, because he wanted, to make a connection with them. He had things he wanted to say that I guess weren't in the speech, and he wanted to make this connection with these young people. So you got to bear in mind, he's not given a carefully phrased, pre-prepared text that's been vetted. And when that happens with Francis, it's often a bit imprecise. So you have to have some generosity and say, what's he trying to say here? Well, when you read the actual paragraph in question, he starts by saying that I admire you young people for your ability to conduct interreligious dialogue. So that's the topic, how to conduct interreligious dialogue. He's not making a general statement in the abstract. He's talking about the proper way to do interreligious dialogue. And he then raises the idea of getting into fights as part of interreligious dialogue. And he solicits an answer from the young people that if you get into fights about, whose God is better than whose, and whose religion is more true and stuff, that's going to lead to destruction. So what he's doing is counseling people against having fights when they're doing religious dialogue. He wants it to be respectful and low-key. That doesn't mean you deny your beliefs. It just means you're respectful and peaceful in how you do religious dialogue. And he then says, he doesn't say all religions lead to God. He said all religions are paths to God, meaning they're ways that people try to pursue God. That doesn't mean they're all going to get you to a correct understanding of God. Much less does it mean that they're all equal and it doesn't matter what your religion you are. We already know this guy is big on evangelization and teaching people about Jesus Christ. What he's not big on is getting into fights about that or other deities as part of interreligious dialogue. So he's acknowledging a truth that, religions can be spoken of as paths to God, in the sense that people walk these paths trying to get closer to God, but that doesn't mean they're all equal or that they're all going to get you to an accurate understanding of God.
Emma?
That makes me feel so much better. Thank you.
Well, we like it when you feel better, Emma. Thank you. Thank you very much for the call. As you've heard me say, the lines are remaining full all afternoon today. So on we go. Let's go to Atlanta, Georgia, where Charles is watching on YouTube. Welcome, Charles. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Yeah, hey. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Question for you. So I am new to the Catholic faith, came into the church at the Vigil this past year.
Congratulations.
And I'm a father of 3 daughters. Oldest is 12. And I am finding myself struggling with catechizing the kids into the faith. So we had been lapsed Episcopalians, hadn't really gone to church for a long time. I love theology. I studied it in school. And so I think I tend to err on the side of being a little too intellectual about the faith. I will go really deep into specific topics with them, and I fear I'm maybe doing more harm than good.
Okay.
So I guess the question for me is, how do I, or if you can recommend some texts that might help me figure out how do I give them a good, solid understanding of the faith while not boring them or maybe making it seem overwhelming to them.
Well, so I normally work with adults, or at least older teenagers. So I haven't really surveyed the literature on catechesis for younger folks. I know that there are catechetical programs that are age appropriate for different levels. Your parish may well have a catechetical program that you could get them involved in, or a youth group or something like that. I know that Ignatius Press has, I want to say it's called Light and Life, but I could be mistaken. I know it has a catechetical series designed for young people of different ages. You also could look at older catechetical material like the Baltimore Catechism. It needs a little update because of legal changes, but there's a variety. And I would just do some checking online and look for catechetical literature for children by good Catholic publishers.
Thanks, Charles. Got to take a quick break. Right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live. What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic. And Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
As we read the Gospels, every Christian faces the question again and again, what does Jesus mean? Getting the answer right is critical to both growth in holiness and fruitful evangelization. Want to know Jesus better so you can introduce him to your friends? Then it's time to get serious about understanding his words. Why not join Catholic Answers for our 10th annual Apologetics Conference? Learn from me the parables, sermons, and conversations of Jesus Christ. September 26th through 29th, right here in sunny San Diego. Learn from our guests, Dr. Scott Hahn and Kimberly Hahn, Dr. Ray Garendi, Father Sebastian Walsh, Billy Junker, Father Paul Check, and, of course, all of your favorite Catholic Answers apologists. It'll be 4 days of fun, faith, fellowship, and a live radio show. Seats are still available, but going fast. Visit CatholicAnswersConference.com or call 1-888-291-8000 today. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. A little bit of groovy music there for you. On a Friday, I notice, I guess, is it a movable feast, the groovy music? It moves to wherever Jimmy is on? All right, I guess groovy music will be on Fridays now. The number is 888-318-7884, and I tell you that because stunningly, lines have opened up. We've had full lines all day, and now there are lines open. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask Jimmy Akin, you're welcome to call. As a matter of fact, we'd love it if you'd call. Whether you're Catholic or not, whatever your question is, you're welcome here. 888-318-7884. We're going to Nebraska now.
Actually, I had a note for Charles.
Right in front of me.
Because my answer was a little truncated because the hard break came up.
All right.
So anyway, I was recommending that Charles do some looking around for catechetical materials that are age appropriate for his daughters from good Catholic publishers. And what I would suggest is, I mean, he can have them go through these materials, but what I would suggest is for him to go through these materials. If he thinks he's being too intellectual in his presentation of theology and doctrine to his daughters, see how other people are doing it. You know, look at material that's been specifically designed for the ages his daughters are, and then he can incorporate a similar level of depth and style in his own presentation of the faith to them. So I would suggest not only having his daughters use these materials, but using them himself. And, perhaps even, if he could enroll them in a catechetical program at church, or he could study, these materials with them at home. And I suspect it's just a matter of finding the right balance with a little bit of experience and preparation.
Charles, I hope that was helpful to you. On we go now to Lewis in Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Lewis, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Okay, my question was if there was any specific requirement that stated how much of the Mass you need to get to validate the Sunday obligation?
Nope, there is not. And that leads to, and that leads to a lot of questions about this, because sometimes people are late, or they need to step out for a minute, or, they need to leave earlier or something. And so people do have questions about this, but what the church has done in the way it's framed the law is not address any of that. And the apparent reason for this, because if you go back in the moral and pastoral literature surrounding the previous rite of Mass, there was some more guidance on this. For example, a common opinion, and I don't know that this was official, but it was a common opinion, was that you needed to be there for the liturgy of the Eucharist. You could miss the entire liturgy of the Word. They didn't call them liturgy of the Word and liturgy of the Eucharist, but they wanted you could miss all that and still fulfill your Sunday obligation. The final entry point that I've seen in the literature where you could show up and have it be valid was the beginning of the canon, the Eucharistic prayer. But when they revised the liturgy, they just said, we want you at the Mass. They didn't specify how much of the Mass. And presumably one of the reasons for that is they do want you there if you can make it for the liturgy of the Eucharist. They don't want you ignoring that. It's an important part of the Mass that's received additional emphasis. Also, they didn't want to encourage scrupulosity, so they don't want people really worrying too much about this. If they did want us to worry about it, they'd give us clearer guidelines. And so I think a fair assessment based on the way the law is written today is to say that you should be there for the whole thing unless you've got a reason not to be. And so if you have a reason not to be there for a particular chunk of the Mass, like I forgot to leave in time, and so I'm going to be 5 minutes late or 10 minutes late or something like that. Well, you have a legitimate reason. You're not saying, I'm going to deliberately stay home and miss part of Mass. Or if you need to step out because you got to go to the bathroom, or you got a screaming kid and, things like that. Well, if you got a reason to step out, then you got a reason to step out and you still fulfill your obligation. So as long as you have a reasonable basis, they want you there for the whole thing. But as long as you've got a reasonable basis for missing some chunk of it, then you can go miss that chunk of it and you'll still fulfill your obligation. And if you have a significant reason for missing the whole Mass, well, then you're excused from your Sunday obligation that Sunday. Like if you're sick or need to take care of someone who's sick or things like that.
Lewis, hope that was helpful. Thank you for the question. Now the lines are full again. So back to the calls we go. Calvin is in Michigan, listening on the Catholic Answers app. Hello, Calvin. You there with us?
Yes.
Well, how old are you, Calvin?
9.
Well, thank you very much for your call. We're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Mr. Akin.
If we all have guardian angels, do we get to see them in heaven, or do they go to someone else who doesn't have one yet?
Okay, so the church doesn't have a teaching on this. This is a matter of theological opinion. Both of your questions are matters of theological opinion. I would say that we are very, very likely to get to meet our guardian angels in heaven. I think I have no doubt that we do. That's my opinion. That's not church teaching, but that's my opinion. On the question of do they get reassigned to someone else, well, that's possible, but I'm less confident of that. It's possible that they do, It's even possible that they have other people they're looking after right now. Since your questions deal with guardian angels, I'll recommend an episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World for you that I did specifically on people's questions about guardian angels. It's episode 325. And so with your parents' permission, you can listen to it by going to mysterious.fm/325. That's mysterious.fm/325. And you can listen to episode 325, which is all about people's questions about guardian angels. I made it because I get so many of these questions, and so I wanted to create a resource that can benefit everybody.
Calvin, I hope you will check it out. And thank you very much for the call and for waiting on the line. We appreciate that you took the time to do that. We go now to Iowa, where Joe is listening on Iowa Catholic Radio. Joe, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, I was wondering, recently I heard that if a man is impotent and is incapable of consummating a marriage, he cannot get married. I guess I was just wondering why.
Because part of what matrimony involves is giving the other person the right to have conjugal relations with you. And that doesn't mean you got to exercise that right. There are what are known as Josephite marriages, where the parties freely choose never to consummate. It's not very common, but it does happen. And those are considered valid marriages. But in those marriages, there is the ability to have matrimonial relations, because, you know, let's say you're a man and your wife later changes her mind and says, no, I want to have relations. I want to get pregnant or whatever. She's got the right to have you have marital relations with her. And if you fundamentally don't have the ability to do so, then you can't fulfill what she has a right to have. And all of this is true if you flip the genders. If a man, is not impotent, but the woman is impotent, all the same principles apply. So this is not based on gender. But what the law says is what invalidates marriage is antecedent, perpetual, and incurable incompetence. So antecedent means it exists before you attempt marriage. If it happens after you attempt marriage, you're still married because you were not impotent at the time of marriage. Perpetual means it just goes on all the time. It's not like, well, sometimes I can fulfill and sometimes I can't. If it's a sometimes I can, well, then you're not perpetually impotent. And so the marriage will be valid. And it has to be incurable, meaning there's no treatment for this, which would enable you to do it at least some of the time. That is kind of going away due to medical advances, because we now have things like, Viagra to help men consummate. And there are penile implants that can help men consummate. And so the incurability of this is largely going away because of medical advances. And so this is applying to fewer and fewer people compared to what used to be the case. But if it's true that one is antecedently, perpetually, and incurably impotent, then you're not able to fulfill one of the obligations of marriage, which is given the marital right to the person you're married to.
And that will bring us right to the break. We'll be right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul street evangelists out in the public square sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because it is the food of the saints that we receive. And for the saints, they understood rightly that the time after Holy Communion, that those moments are the most precious moments of our lives.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. For me, it has gone quickly. I realize I am not doing the bulk of the work here, but this has been a very quick 2 hours. Lots and lots of great calls. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, and we're going now to San Antonio, Texas, where Michael is listening on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Michael, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hello, Cy. Hello, Jimmy. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi, Michael.
So there's people that argue because God knows everything, we don't have free will. So how do you reconcile God's omniscience with free will?
Okay, so it's interesting that you asked this, because as Cy and I were talking, I've just launched this new Jimmy Akin podcast, and episode 1 came out this last week, and it's on what God really wants. And episode 2 is coming out on Monday, and it is on exactly this question. How do we reconcile God's omniscience, including his knowledge of the future, with our free will? So I would recommend that you listen to episode 2 of the Jimmy Akin podcast, and it'll go into more detail than I can at the moment. But to give you the core of the answer, knowledge has nothing to do with other people's choices. Let's keep it in the human realm for just a second. Suppose that you and I, Michael, are in the same room, and I see you reading a book. The fact that I know you're reading a book does not force you to read the book. You're reading the book of your own free will. I just happen to know it. Then suppose I hop in my time machine and visit you a year from now. And once again, a year from now, I also see you reading a book. Well, I'm not forcing you to read that book. You're choosing to read that book of your own free will. I'm just aware of it. And if I then come back in time and say, oh, guess what? You're going to be reading a book a year from now. I haven't violated your free will. Nothing I've done forces you to read either one of those books. You're choosing to do that by yourself. This is exactly the situation that we have with God, except God is outside of time. So to him, all times are equally real. He sees what you were doing a year ago, he sees what you're doing right now, and he sees what you're going to be doing a year from now. And so if he sees you reading a book in the present, he knows that. And if he sees you reading a book at a point that's currently in your future, he's aware of that, but he's not forcing you to do either of those things. You're freely choosing it. God's just aware of it. And so that's the core of the answer. Knowledge simply has nothing to do, knowledge of what other people are doing has nothing to do with forcing them to do it.
All right, great. That was a great response. Pretty funny that that's going to be your second episode. Thanks for that.
Well, Michael, thank you for the call. Thank you for the call and for the question. Jimmy Akin, our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. We're going to Raleigh, North Carolina now, where Marie is listening on Divine Mercy Radio. Marie, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Well, we know that Jesus' body and Mary's body are in heaven, and most people have symbiosis with other organisms, a microbiome and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So would that mean that there are critters up in heaven with Mary and Jesus that hitched a ride along?
Okay. Well, so it's true that we do have microbiomes, and in fact, the number of cells in our bodies that belong to our microbiomes is actually larger than the number of human cells in our bodies. This is something we know today, but it's not something they knew in the first century. And so the sources of faith really don't address this question. So this is not a matter of church teaching, it's a matter of speculation. Now, historically, many theologians have been of the opinion that you need a rational soul in order to survive death. And so they would say that, animals, at least macroscopic animals like dogs and cats and stuff, don't have an afterlife. I think that's a very problematic view. That's also not church teaching. That's just theological opinion. And I did an episode of Mysterious World on that, where I went through the arguments against animal afterlife and concluded they don't work. And I also uncovered some empirical evidence that would suggest at least some animals do have an afterlife. That's episode 203 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. If you want to listen to it, you can get to it by going to mysterious.fm/203. So that answers, I think, part of the question, but it doesn't answer all of it, because even if you said, okay, these microorganisms we've got don't have an afterlife, well, they could reproduce. If so, Jesus, let's say, has, a microbiome, he's got gut flora, and then when he ascends into heaven, the gut flora, unless God doesn't want to bring it, is going to go with him. And even if gut flora has no afterlife at all, they can still be reproducing 2,000 years later. So that's hypothetically possible, even if animals don't have an afterlife. You still got to consider this possibility. I would say that the answer, in forming an opinion on this, the answer would be unclear to me. Because one of the things that the New Testament teaches is that in the afterlife, we may not need to eat food. There are at least some passages, particularly in 1 Corinthians, where St. Paul says, like, God made food for the stomach and the stomach for food, but he's going to destroy them both, and we're going to have a spiritual body and stuff like that. And that could be read as saying we're not going to eat anymore. It also could, on the other hand, there are other passages that depict heaven as a great banquet or feast with God and the saints. So I think it's unclear whether or not we're going to have whether we're going to eat in the afterlife. It might be the case that we don't need to, but we may do it anyway, for fun and glorifying God and stuff. Well, if we're eating food, then I would say we probably have gut flora, because that's one of the things that's a key component of our ability to digest food. Is, the gut flora does a lot of the work for that. And that's how we evolved a symbiotic relationship with our gut microbiome. We ingest food, the microbes break it down into things that we can eat, and they also get some of the nutrients of the food. So I would think if we're eating, then we probably have gut flora in heaven. On the other hand, if we don't eat, we might not have gut flora in heaven. Now, digestion is one of the functions that our microbiome covers, but it's not the only one. We also have a microbiome providing defense of us as an add-on or auxiliary help to our immune system. But we know we're not going to be sick in heaven. So it could be that part of the reason we're not sick in heaven is because we still have gut flora or microbiome assisting our immune system. Or it could be God just renders us supernaturally immune to any disease or injury, in which case we wouldn't need microbiome to be performing that function for us anymore. That wouldn't tell us it's not there, but it would mean that we at least don't need it. So I would say that the answer to this one for me is thoroughly murky.
What do you think of that, Marie?
Oh, it's pretty good. I mean, but you have to admit that you could eat it with a resurrected body, because Jesus ate. So
yep.
Huh? That at least is an indication that something might continue. And so anyway, but it's just a very interesting question.
It's actually a fascinating question.
It's definite that you can eat, because Jesus did, as you point out. He did that in order to prove to the disciples that he was physically alive, and we won't need to prove that in the next life. So you could propose, well, even though we can eat, we won't, but we may still continue eating.
I have to say, Maria, I really enjoyed the question. I don't remember the question of whether the symbiotic organisms in our bodies would accompany us to heaven. I don't remember. Jimmy, you get a lot of interesting questions. You might remember that, but I don't remember ever having heard it before.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Thanks, Marie.
They're all good. It's just the answers that can be bad.
Rarely, very rarely. Let's go to Elizabeth in Indianapolis. Marie, thanks again. Elizabeth is watching on YouTube. Welcome, Elizabeth. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Okay. Hello, Cy, and hello, Jimmy.
Hello, Elizabeth.
My question is, are divorced Catholics allowed to receive communion? And then, if you have time, I'd love to know your opinion on the apparitions of Garabandal, Spain.
Okay, so just because someone's divorced, it doesn't mean that they're prohibited from receiving communion, assuming nothing else is affecting the situation. Now, if you abandoned your spouse for selfish reasons, without a good reason, you just said, I'm out of here. Well, that was a sin and a grave sin, so you'd need to go to confession. But once you've gone to confession and you've repented, you could receive communion. On the other hand, if you get divorced and you marry someone else, then the church is going to presume that you're still bound to that first spouse, because Jesus indicated that that divorce followed by remarriage is adultery. And so if you marry someone else, or you want to marry someone else, the church needs to look at that first marriage to see, was it valid or not? Are you free to marry someone else? And that's what's commonly called the annulment process. But just being divorced is not of itself in principle sinful, and therefore people who are divorced can receive communion unless something else is affecting the situation. Now, what was your second question?
Well, I know a lot of people have asked about the rulings.
Garabandal.
Apparitions.
Yeah.
And I wondered if they said anything at all about Garabandal, Spain.
There have been some lower level rulings on Garabandal that were negative. And so I haven't studied the Garabandal case in detail. I plan to do an episode of Mysterious World on it in the future. And for that, I will dig into it and study it. But my understandings are that none of the lower level decisions that have been announced on it supported it being supernatural.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. I appreciate it. I really love the show, and I love both of you, too. You're very, very helpful in my Catholic life.
Oh, thank you
so much.
That's a very kind thing to say. I'll tell you what, do we have other calls? Or should I know we have a question from YouTube, and I can get to that question from YouTube, but if there are, I think we got nobody else on the line at the moment to get to. So a question from YouTube, don't have a name for it. Via my free will, can I override God's will? Or does this mean I have a limited will, since God's will so clearly trumps my own? If so, I claim that I am not culpable and not responsible.
Okay, so in order to answer this question, you have to clarify which will of God are you talking about. Theologians commonly distinguish between God's preceptive will, which is what he wants to happen, and his permissive will, which is what he allows to happen. Well, so in terms of God's preceptive will, God wants you to not commit adultery. But do you have the ability to commit adultery, to sleep with someone who's married to someone else, or someone that, if you're married, that you sleep with someone you're not married to? Yeah, you got the ability to do that. And in that, you can overcome God's preceptive will. He's given us that freedom. You shouldn't, but you can. What about his permissive will? Well, if he allows you to do something, then you obviously didn't overcome it. So if God permitted you to commit adultery, then you didn't overcome his permissive will. There is, though, a third kind of will that isn't often talked about as much in theology, and that looks at the range of actions that humans are able to do. For example, humans are able to breathe and process oxygen as part of their metabolism. It's God's will for that to happen. And we can do that. But it is not God's will to allow humans to fly without technological assistance under ordinary circumstances. I mean, maybe some saints get to levitate, but humans can't ordinarily fly. But in that, you cannot override God's will. But that doesn't mean you don't have responsibility for choosing good and evil, which is the real issue here.
All right. Thank you to everybody who called and for all the questions. Check out Jimmy Akin's new podcast. You can find it at his YouTube page or wherever you get your podcasts. And Jimmy, thanks very much. Enjoyed those 2 hours.
My pleasure. Have a great weekend.
Hey, next week we're at the conference, so the show will be live. Jimmy will be one of the guests on Thursday from the conference, and if you're coming, looking forward to seeing you. That'll do it for us. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.